Welcome, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join today's presentation on a deeply troubling and urgent issue that impacts Indigenous communities across the United States and other countries with Indigenous tribes. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, MMIW Crisis. My name is Harry Ken Singh, and I will cover this crisis, which represents a stark reality faced by Indigenous families and communities, underscoring the need for immediate attention, awareness, and meaningful action. Throughout this presentation, we will delve into the multifaceted aspect of the MMIW crisis, exploring its historical and systemic roots, the profound emotional and cultural impacts on Indigenous communities, and the ongoing efforts to bring visibility to this issue through advocacy and grassroots initiative. We will also discuss the role of collective action, both within Indigenous communities and in broader society, as a vital component in addressing this crisis and ensuring justice for the victims and their families. Understanding the gravity and complexity of this issue is essential to fostering meaningful change. I will cover three subjects: emotional and cultural impact, growing awareness, and a call to action. Together, we can work toward creating a society that prioritizes safety, accountability, and support for Indigenous women and their families while honoring the cultural significance and resilience of the Indigenous community. Thank you for being part of this important conversation. And I will start with the video of the MMIW song. As stated previously, I will be covering these three subjects: emotional and cultural impact, growing awareness, and call to action. Emotional and cultural impact for Indigenous women face disproportionately high rates of violence, significantly more than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Alarming statistics indicate that approximately 1 in 3 Indigenous women experience rape in her lifetime, as highlighted by Skylar Joseph in his article, A Modern Trail of Tears, The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Crisis in the U.S. The implication of this crisis extends beyond individual experiences. They devastate families and lead to a profound sense of loss and trauma that permeates entire communities and cultures. Joseph underscores that the homicide rate for Indigenous women is nearly 10 times higher than that of other demographic groups, further illustrating the urgency of addressing this issue as a public safety crisis. These staggering numbers are not merely statistics, but represent a historical continuity of violence rooted in colonization and systemic oppression. Over centuries, colonial policies have undermined Indigenous societies and eroded traditional cultural practices, while government actions such as the Indian Removal Act and the legacy of residential schools have left indelible scars on Indigenous identity and community structures. The lasting effects of these policies perpetuate cycles of violence against Indigenous women, exacerbating vulnerabilities connecting to poverty, lack of access to health care, and systemic injustice. Growing awareness. In response to the MMIW crisis, the recent efforts have been made to raise awareness and foster community engagement. One significant initiative is the establishment of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Awareness Day on May 5th. Celia Nawal, in her article, What to Know About Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Awareness Day, emphasizes the importance of this day in shining light on the urgent need for action and the healing within Indigenous communities. This observance aims to bring together individuals, organizations to honor those lost and advocate for systemic change. Call to action. As we delve deeper into the complexities of the MMIW crisis, it is imperative to explore both the statistics that highlight its severity and the ongoing efforts to bring justice and support to affected families. It is crucial for individuals and communities to reflect on how they can collectively contribute to raising awareness and advocating for change. First and foremost, educating ourselves and our communities about the MMIW crisis and its historical context is essential.
Her body was found wrapped in trash bags in the Red River.
She was kidnapped, raped. She was meant to be trafficked.
The people have gone missing since European settlers set land here on Turtle Island.
The fact that we are all still here speaks to the resiliency of so many of our ancestors.
It wasn't until I was invited to curate where I connected my family story to the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic. Oh my gosh, my grandma's part of that story.
600 registered sex offenders living in their town.
We have tricked ourselves into believing that being extractive and domineering is the way to be.
If you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Among the newcomers is Ruth Buffalo, who became the first Native American Democratic woman elected in North Dakota.
Thank you, Representative Ruth Buffalo. You were meant to serve.
How does somebody, when something bad happens to them, how do they come back to who they are?
The other exit is over here. This group, we're going to go over here. Our pain is not for their extraction.
For dancing to bring that healing.
It's
for all people here on this planet.
As stated earlier, 1 in 3 Indigenous women experience rape in their lifetime, a stark and horrifying statistic highlighted by Skylar Joseph in his article, A Modern Trail of Tears, The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Crisis in the U.S. This chilling reality is a testament to the pervasive violence that Indigenous women face, compounded by the long-standing neglect and systemic barriers within society. Such a staggering figure underscores the urgency of addressing this crisis and taking meaningful steps to provide safety, justice, and healing for Indigenous women and their communities. The roots of this crisis are deeply intertwined with the historical context of colonization and systemic oppression. The arrival of colonial powers brought about the displacement of Indigenous people, the destruction of cultural systems, and the marginalization of Indigenous communities. These historical injustices have left a legacy of trauma and structural inequalities, perpetuating cycles of violence and neglect that disproportionately affect Indigenous women. The systemic erasure of Indigenous voices and experiences has allowed this crisis to persist in the shadows for far too long, demanding a conscious reckoning with history and its ongoing impact. Exacerbating the issues are the systemic failings in the justice system, which create significant barriers for Indigenous women seeking protection and justice. Community-driven advocacy, education, empowerment initiatives are equally critical in bringing visibility to the MMIW crisis and fostering resilience within Indigenous communities. Collaboration among government agencies, nonprofits, and tribal leaders is essential to developing holistic solutions that center their voices and needs of Indigenous women and their families. Ultimately, tackling this crisis is not only about justice for those who have been harmed, but about dismantling systemic inequities and ensuring the safety and dignity of Indigenous women for generations to come. This crisis is not a new phenomenon, but rather a continuation of centuries of violence, discrimination, and neglect faced by Indigenous people. The legacy of colonization brought not only the physical displacement of Indigenous communities, but also the systematic dismantling of their cultures, social, and economic structures. Colonizers imposed patriarchal systems that disrupted Indigenous matriarchal and egalitarian traditions, eroding the respect and value historically accorded to Indigenous women. Combined with forced assimilation such as through boarding schools, loss of land, and the suppression of Indigenous languages and traditions, these systemic assaults left deep scars that continue to manifest in the vulnerabilities Indigenous women face today. The MMIW crisis is a modern reflection of these historical injustices, illustrating how centuries of systemic oppression have laid the groundwork for continued violence, exploitation, and neglect. One of the most significant obstacles to addressing the MMIW crisis lies in the complex jurisdictional dynamics that impede investigations into missing and murdered Indigenous persons. Tribal lands operate under a unique and often convoluted legal framework due to their status as sovereign nations within the United States. However, jurisdiction over crimes committed on tribal lands is often shared or disputed among tribal, state, and federal authorities, creating confusion, delays in taking action. Many crimes fall under the purview of federal agencies, but due to underfunding, lack of resources, and cultural misunderstanding, these cases frequently receive inadequate attention. The annual observance of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Awareness Day, held on May 5th, serves several vital purposes in the fight against this crisis. It is a day dedicated to honoring the memories of those who have been lost and standing in solidarity with their families and communities, many of whom are still seeking answers and justice.
According to the Justice Department's National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, some 600,000 Americans go missing every year. Thankfully, most of them are found quickly unharmed. But there remain tens of thousands of cold cases, including a disproportionate number among members of one American community. In our Sunday Spotlight, Harry Smith reports from Montana as part of the NBC News series, Missing in America.
Jen Buckley carefully applies red paint to her hand. The paint is symbolic. It speaks of violence, of silence, and resilience. It's art intended to have an impact, to awaken a state and a continent to a tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
I think collectively it just doesn't seem like our Indigenous lives are as important as some others. When people go missing, they're not looked for the same way.
Missoula, Montana County Attorney Kirsten Pabst.
It's an epidemic. When you look at the numbers, 25 to 30% of our missing persons are Native, when they only make up about 6 to 7% of our population.
There are issues of jurisdiction. Whose problem? Tribal or municipal? And state, local, or even federal law enforcement.
What do you think the roots of it are?
I think you have to go back hundreds of years to colonization and cultural degradation of our Native American cultures. We're to the point now where we have to do something different.
For an epidemic mostly unnoticed and rarely publicized, that something different fell to Buckley, who is an enrolled member of the Chippewa Cree tribes out of Rocky Boy, Montana.
I just came up with maybe I'll just see if anybody wants to get their picture taken with the red handprint on their face to raise awareness. So that's how it started. And then I just started to think, what is a large scale thing that people see that they have to see? And I don't know, there's billboards.
Lamar Billboards donates the space, but Buckley and her project are on a shoestring budget.
I can raise the $200, it's up for a month, and then it comes down because I gotta wait till I have the next $200 to put it back up.
It's needed because too often attention goes elsewhere.
Just look at that white female that went missing.
Gabby Petito, missing for weeks.
How many Native American females went missing in that same time period and there was nothing, so not a blip.
Veteran Missoula Police Detective Guy Baker.
Those billboards are a great way to bring awareness to this very important issue.
Important to Detective Baker because maybe a billboard will help him solve a case he's worked for 4 years, the missing Jermaine Charlo. Jermaine is the niece of Valinda Morajo, so close she feels like a sister. During our visit, Valinda volunteered to be photographed by Jen Buckley.
The work Jennifer is doing is important. I'm hoping that her work reaches outside of Montana, that we can get billboards in New York, all the way down to Texas and up into Canada. This is crisis and it needs to stop.
How is it for you to know your sister has been gone these years now?
It's been extremely hard.
Maybe this could make a difference.
It will. It will. I know it will.
For Sunday Today, Harry Smith, Missoula, Montana.
Indigenous women are disproportionately affected by violence compared to non-Indigenous women, with some reports indicating that they are 10 times more likely to be murdered. This devastating statistic paints a stark and troubling picture of the unique vulnerabilities faced by Indigenous women in the United States and other parts of North America. This disproportionate rate of violence is not a random occurrence, but the result of a long history of systemic inequities, discrimination, and oppression. Many contributing factors underpin the alarming disparity, including the historical effects of colonization, forced displacement, systemic poverty, historical trauma, and the breakdown of social support system. Moreover, inequities in access to health care, economic opportunity, and education exacerbate the marginalization that contributes to the increased rates of violence. Compounding these challenges is the persistent failures of the justice system to adequately respond to cases of violence against Indigenous women. Jurisdictional conflicts, racial bias, and underfunding of law enforcement and victim services have created barriers that leave families, communities with limited recourse or support when cases of violence occur. The inability of law enforcement agencies and the legal system to provide timely and effective responses leave survivors and their families with a deep sense of frustration, grief, and mistrust in institutions. These systemic failures reinforce the perception that violence against Indigenous women is not a priority, further isolating victims and preventing meaningful accountability. In response to this crisis, lawmakers, policymakers, and advocacy organizations are working to push forward legislative initiatives designed to address the root cause of the violence, strengthen prevention strategies, and improve the response to missing and murdered Indigenous women. One critical piece of legislation is the Not Invisible Act, which represents an important step towards systemic reform and coordinated action. The Non-Invisible Act seeks to improve the response to the crisis by enhancing data collection, improving interagency communication and coordination among law enforcement agencies, fostering collaboration across multiple jurisdictions.
A show of force at Winnipeg's most famous intersection. On Red Dress Day, demand for an end to the murders and disappearances of countless Indigenous women and girls.
I just feel like we haven't been served justice for a very, very long time.
We're people too.
So right now, we're just showing that there are people out there standing up for our lives.
This project was...
That fight taken all the way to London. Lives lost, not forgotten, even as some Indigenous leaders gather for the coronation.
Awesome! This red dress.
Nikki Kumak-Siutiksak says little has improved since her cousin Jessica Michaels died 22 years ago.
We're human beings. Why is it okay that we are facing a genocide? Why is it okay that this is happening and the government is not doing anything?
We've had a lot of prayers and thoughts and wringing of hands and promises to do better by all levels of government. And yet we end up with Indigenous women in garbage dumps.
The former chief commissioner of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered doesn't know how to grade Ottawa's response to its recommendations. She says progress is hard to track and much too slow.
That's an observation that is difficult to refute.
The Crown Indigenous Relations Minister says his government will announce new funding for Indigenous shelters soon, but money alone isn't going to stop the violence.
This is a tragedy that needs more than a response of public policy based on tragedy.
Fundamental change in the very way society values and treats lives. Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News, Ottawa.
In conclusion, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, MMIW Crisis, is an urgent and pressing matter that demands the collective attention, action, and commitment of all members of society. This crisis is not just a statistic or distant issue, but a devastating reality that continues to tear apart Indigenous communities across the United States and North America. The emotional and cultural impacts on these communities are profound, stemming from centuries of historical injustice, systemic oppression, forced assimilation, and displacement that intersect with contemporary issues of violence and discrimination. These historical traumas have left a lasting legacy, shaping the challenges that Indigenous women face today. Efforts to raise awareness, such as Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Awareness Day, play a vital role in promoting understanding, encouraging dialogue, and building solidarity. This annual observance provides a platform to honor the memories of the missing and murdered, amplifying the voices of their families, and call attention to the systemic inequities that allow this crisis to persist. It also fosters opportunities for education, advocacy, and the sharing of resources that can empower communities to confront these challenges. Whether through grassroots organizing, support Indigenous-led initiatives, demanding legislative change, or participating in community education campaigns, each of us has a role to play in dismantling the structural inequities that have enabled this crisis to continue for far too long. Education and awareness are powerful tools that can break cycles of violence by addressing harmful misconceptions, challenging systemic inequities, and fostering cross-cultural understanding. By actively learning about the historical and social context of the MMIW crisis, we can all become more informed and advocate at advocacy organizations ensure in response to this crisis are culturally informed, sustainable, and reflect of the needs of the priorities of communities most impacted. Together, we can envision and work toward a future where Indigenous women are safe, valued, and empowered. Envision that works toward a future where Indigenous women are safe, valued, and empowered. A future where they can live without fear of violence, where their voices are amplified and heard, and where justice is not just an abstract concept, but a lived reality. Let us commit to building a world in which equity, dignity, and opportunity are accessible to all, and where their legacies of violence are replaced by healing, support, and injustice. Thank you for your attention, your compassion, and your commitment to beginning this vital conversation. The work to address the MMIW crisis is far from over, but through shared action, solidarity, and continued advocacy, we can create change. Let this be the start of a meaningful and sustained effort to break the cycle of violence, honoring the lives of those who have been lost, and build a better, more equitable future.
MMIP stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous People. Essentially, what it comes down to is our people are being taken, our people are being murdered, and it's happening in plain sight.
A lot of the perpetrators of the violence on Indigenous women are non-Indigenous men who are able to come onto reservation space and do harm and not come to any justice because of their non-Indigenous status. So the tribal courts have no jurisdiction over them. The state courts have no jurisdiction over that reservation space, and the only people that do have that jurisdiction are the federal courts and the federal police, which are the FBI and the DIA. So when an Indigenous woman is murdered, in a way, it's like, I mean, the FBI is not going to come investigate what they consider to be a small-time murder. The tribes aren't given the actual power to protect their people, and that power is given to people who aren't using it.
The fear of being a target has not gone away from me, and I'm not proud of this, but because of how unsafe I feel in situations, I feel like I have to hide my identity, hide who I am.
The world at large is not aware of this issue. And, in our communities, we live and breathe it every day. Every person I know can list someone that has, is missing or been murdered.
My niece, Kimberly Michelle, lost her life 14 years ago. A few years later, we found out that her death was actually ruled homicide by asphyxiation, and there was no investigation done to find out, who murdered her or to bring about any prosecution.
Today's event was about raising the awareness of those that have been affected by this in our community. I feel like today's event was an opportunity to not just bring support for our families that are affected by these tragedies, but also the chance to educate, the outsiders, again, that are in our community. These settings that we all expressed are very uncomfortable and are very hard to share, but we're here for a reason, and we're still here. Today, they passed around like the keychains with the beads and everything, but it was also about signifying a moment, with those that are missing. We said the names today. We talked about a really deep topic, and when I know every single one of us touched on connecting and healing and getting to a place of healing our communities through these conversations. I'm thankful that I come from a community that cares so much about these issues and recognize how important it is to educate outsiders, because that is how we're going to dismantle it, is by continuing to educate. And I believe what we saw today is doing exactly that.